Hello, HalfPint here, and I just wanted to say real quick, if you've been enjoying my content, please remember to subscribe to the channel here on YouTube and follow me on Twitch so you can always catch us when we're live and see more content. Also, if you are new here, welcome in, and if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like it because it helps me out a lot. I also post funny clips and other things on TikTok. All the links are in the description below, and thanks again. Now let's get into the video. The first thing we're going to look at today is the Supreme Court of the United States is hearing a case possibly regarding the reversing of affirmative action, and students and faculty at Harvard and one other university are fighting to maintain it, arguing that it does much more good than harm, which is true. Obviously, requiring things like affirmative action are less than ideal and technically a little racist even. It's technically a little racist to keep very close count of, you know, which ethnicities and genders and nationalities you have at your job, you know? But we know if we don't keep track and institute minimums, we know that the end result is a huge sliding towards minorities. Positions will only, for the most part, go to white people with white names, and we know that doesn't work. It leads to more problems and does more harm than good, which is why we instituted affirmative action in the first place. But kind of like with everything, it seems like anything that was instituted, I don't know, 25, 50 years ago, we're just reversing, like, because it's far enough away that Republicans seem to think that everyone forgot why it's necessary, which is just not true.
Diversity, as important as it is, cannot come at the expense of Asian Americans.
These Asian American students are leading a fight against affirmative action.
It's time for Asian Americans to break up with woke diversity.
They're at the center of a lawsuit against Harvard, accusing the Ivy League school of discriminating against Asian Americans to make more room for Hispanics and blacks. Calvin Yang, who's now a sophomore at UC Berkeley, claims he was denied admission to Harvard because of his race.
It goes to show that there is a trend here, a trend where Asian Americans are systematically getting discriminated because of who we are.
Now the case against Harvard and a separate but related suit against UNC Chapel Hill is coming before the Supreme Court.
The current law.
Conservative activist Edward Bloom has been leading the crusade to end affirmative action for nearly a decade.
Classifying students by race and ethnicity, treating them differently because of their race and ethnicity, it's unfair.
Yeah, obviously it's unfair and it's not ideal, and it kind of flies in the face of what it's trying to accomplish. But we know what happens if we don't.
Bloom started the group Students for Fair Admissions and initiated cases against Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill years ago. Harvard is accused of holding Asian Americans to a higher standard and capping their numbers, but the school says it sets no limits. At UNC Chapel Hill, some students say there's too much weight on race in admissions, resulting in discrimination against whites and Asian Americans. The school, though, contends it takes a holistic approach to admissions decisions. Multiple federal judges have ruled neither school has violated the Constitution by considering race in the admissions process. But now Bloom and his supporters are banking on the Supreme Court reversing its own precedent and banning the use of affirmative action.
I think that is something that has been polarizing, it has been problematic, and I think the nation is ready for this.
Julia Clark leads the group Black Student Movement at UNC, and she says,
How could you possibly think that the nation is ready for this when we have Black Lives Matter protests every day in the country, and we have unarmed black people being murdered by the police all the time? How could you possibly think we're at a point now where prejudice is done away with and affirmative action is an antiquated system? Please explain to me why you think There is no racial tension in the United States currently. Please outline how that's true for me. What the fuck are you talking about?
Race is an essential element for universities to consider.
We cannot have holistic admissions without race, because race is embedded into every single facet of everyday life for people that come from diverse backgrounds.
Already, 9 states ban the use of affirmative action in admissions decisions at public universities. But leaders at the University of California and the University of Michigan say their race-neutral admissions policies have not worked, telling the Supreme Court in filings they haven't been able to significantly increase enrollment of underrepresented minorities since affirmative action bans in their states took effect.
I know that certainly in California, there have been definite attempts to try and even the playing field in other ways, and they've had a limited impact. There's a chilling effect when students don't feel welcome, either by legislation or otherwise. They're not going to want to come to a university that has banned affirmative action, that doesn't value that diversity.
Right.
Now it's up to the Supreme Court to set the final word of whether affirmative action can continue.
I want to see affirmative action being repealed and become illegal in college admission system across this country.
I think I speak for myself and other Black students that we really are scared at the end of the day.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
The U.S. Supreme Court hearing arguments in 2 major cases yesterday that could determine the future of affirmative action in higher education across America. Despite 40 years of legal precedent supporting consideration of race in college admissions, a conservative advocacy group is suing UNC Chapel Hill and Harvard University, asking the justices to issue a blanket ban on the practice. But not everyone agrees with the court's potential ruling. Our next guest, Chelsea Wang,
It's so interesting that they're saying like this blanket approach to admissions isn't working, so we need a blanket ban on it.
sophomore at Harvard University, joins me now to discuss why she supports affirmative action. Chelsea, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you were
cool.
on the
Feedback.
ground there in D.C., rallying alongside fellow students and inside the court for yesterday's hearing. Tell us about why you feel so compelled to actually be here in the nation's capital and to be present for that.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important to see Asian Americans advocating for affirmative action because we occupy such a central role in this particular lawsuit. SFFA's argument implies that Asian Americans are monolithically disadvantaged by affirmative action and that we are all opposed to affirmative action, but we know that that's not true.
Right, yeah, no.
69%.
It's probably not true for, almost for certain not true for any race. But like that's like part of the whole problem, right? With the prejudice in this country is assuming that like every single person who is a minority represents their entire minority. Like, oh, cool, one Asian person spoke out against affirmative action, so Asians are against affirmative action. Nope. One Asian student who felt slighted because of his personal experience. That's all it was.
Of Asian Americans support affirmative action, and in going to DC, I want to play my part in breaking the stereotype that Asian Americans are politically inactive and that we don't care about anything but our own personal gains.
I didn't know that.
So
Dude, sometimes racism gets so specific that I didn't even know. Like she was saying, break the stereotype that Asians are politically inactive and only care about their own gain. I could definitely see a very old mentality of only care about their own gain. But politically inactive, I've never heard that. Kind of glad I've never heard that, but at the same time, that sucks that that's a thing. And isn't it just young people who are politically inactive, which is slowly changing too, but like, how the fuck are you just gonna blame that on someone's race if they're like, you're fucking 18? Like, oh, you're just politically inactive because you're Asian. No, it's because I just got out of high school and I don't know what the fuck is going on. Are you serious?
Talk a little bit more about that. Students for Fair Admissions, a multiracial and multi-ethnic group of 22,000 students and parents, are the ones alleging that Asian Americans are being illegally discriminated against based on race when applying for colleges. So as a Chinese American, they're at Harvard, the center of this story, right? Do you believe that there is merit to this? And have you felt discriminated against based on your race when applying to colleges?
I can't say that I have. And if we look at the numbers and if we look at the analysis, we know that that's just not true. Dr. Card, he conducted a pretty rigorous analysis of the admissions process, and he found that the effect of Asian American ethnicity on an applicant's likelihood of admission is statistically indistinguishable from zero.
Okay.
And therefore,
Okay, so if it's statistically indistinguishable from zero, then it has virtually zero impact, no impact on whether or not you will be admitted or rejected. I would really like more information on why this lawsuit started. I am interested to understand why it was felt that being Asian specifically influenced the rejection. Or is it just you were rejected and you're blaming it on affirmative action? Because it's now starting to sound like that.
out of the 6 years that he analyzed, the effect of being an Asian American woman like me actually has a positive effect on an applicant's likelihood of admission.
So, as you know, not everyone supports affirmative action. So let's take a listen to just some of those who are against the consideration of race in college admissions, and I want to get your response.
If you don't include race, it's a more holistic review. You kind of get to see the student academically, what they really are. You read their personal statement.
That's what we think. That's the ideal viewpoint, is if we eliminate race, you're just looking at them as a student. But that's just not true. There is profiling that is done from names. There's profiling that is done from socioeconomic status. There's profiling that is done from your zip code. Profiling exists in so many different ways. So we know, based off history, the greatest teacher, how this will go if affirmative action is removed. Like I've said several times throughout this, profiling of different ways will take over, and we will end up with predominantly white people being educated and minorities being disregarded and, rejected at higher rates, like old America.
You read their, you see their SAT scores, you see a lot of things, you see their supplements. I think that itself should say more about the student than the race. And I think if they were to eliminate that, having to fill in a box for race, I think a lot more people like myself would actually be in those schools.
I just feel like once we remove that factor from the equation, I think it'll be more of an even playing field for people who come underprepared, have that, talent to really make it and have the opportunity to go there.
What do you think?
That doesn't make any sense. So if we're just looking at their academics, people who are underprepared probably will get rejected, right? Instead of having some sort of positive impact on their application because of affirmative action, they would be rejected inherently because they are underprepared. Isn't that what would make the most sense in a system where you're only looking at the academics of each person?
Chelsea?
Yeah, I think race is inextricable from a lot of people's stories.
Yes.
We know that.
We know that living in America is, like I was saying at the very beginning of all this, racial tensions are high in America and pretty much have been forever because racism is deeply embedded in American culture. White supremacism is embedded in American culture. The Eurocentric patriarchy is embedded in American culture. So race is a part of everything here. There was slavery based off race in this country. Not very many places in the world had slavery based off race. A lot of places had slavery based off debt, which is why their transitions out of slavery weren't as lengthy, long, ugly, and still happening as much as it is here. Because it wasn't some inherent view that people should be in a lesser position. It was just based off of the fact that you were in debt. So it's impossible to pretend that race isn't a part of everyday life in America, especially like I was saying with Black Lives Matter protests happening every day, with unarmed black people being murdered by the fucking police all the time, with the policing, over-policing of minority neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, and the criminalization of being poor or a person without a home in this country, and the careful targeting of, you know, like the war on drugs. I could go on and on and on about how this country has worked to specifically target poor people, which the country also works very hard to make sure the majority of poor people are minorities, or at the very least the majority of minorities in this country are poor. It's all about taking power, capital, and from someone and keeping it at the top, right? And they love taking from no one more than underrepresented and underprotected minorities. It's the American playbook, and it's disgusting. But to pretend that like race is not a part of everyday life in America is incredibly either disingenuous or idealistic to a point of like full-on naivety. I feel like you'd have to be incredibly privileged to feel like race has nothing to do with anything in America. Ideally, yes. On paper, yes. Logically, yes. In reality, no. No, there's a lot of racist people running around doing racist things, and there's a lot of like ingrained prejudice that is still working its way out.
Students of color, Black and Latinx students in particular, don't have the same educational opportunities that other students do.
Yeah.
They tend to go to underfunded, segregated schools. They are perceived differently by teachers, whether consciously or
segregated by zip code. By the way, segregated by zip codes. Zip codes are heavily dictate your socioeconomic status. Heavily dictates your zip code. Your zip code dictates your school. Your school dictates your education. And the funding of that school dictates your education. This is what I'm talking about. These are the systematic things in place. I'm saying where like it's impossible to pretend that race has nothing to do with anything here.
Subconsciously. And that actually disadvantages students over their entire educational process.
Yeah.
And considering race in the admissions process
completely changes the trajectory.
One small thing we can do to mitigate those impacts and contextualize all of those factors. We also know that seemingly objective metrics like the SAT and GPAs, they're not actually as objective as they seem.
No.
And, you know, considering race in the admissions process is essential.
Didn't the SAT and ACT start as like a form of redlining? SAT history of race. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's exactly what I thought. As many students returned to in-person, but in April 2020, educators across the country criticized the decision, saying the idea students should be forced to take any sort of standardized test this year is incomprehensible. The priority right now should be strengthening instruction. That kind of makes sense. We still think that there's something wrong with the kids rather than recognizing there's something wrong with the test. That's a really good way to put it. Anti-Racist Research Policy Center in October. Standardized tests have become the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade black and brown minds and legally exclude their bodies from prestigious schools. Yet some organizations insist on more testing, arguing the data will get some where support. Okay. While much has been said about the racial achievement gap as a civil rights issue, more attention needs to be paid to the measurement tools used to define that gap. Education reformists, civil rights organizations, and all who are connected with racial justice and education need to advocate for assessment tools that don't replicate racial and economic inequality. To tell the truth about standardized tests, is to tell the story of the eugenicists who created and popularized these tests in the United States more than a century ago. Many of them white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, of course. Public schools, psychologist, and eugenicist Carl Brigham wrote that the African Americans were on the low end of the racial, ethnic, and/or cultural spectrum. Testing, he believed, showed the superiority of the Nordic race group, or white people, and warned that the promiscuous intermingling of new immigrants in the American gene pool. So this guy was a straight fucking white supremacist. He was a literal eugenicist. And we use his test still, or a derivative of his test. And like, how is that so hard to understand? If you take something that was literally created to filter out minorities, okay? It's created to prioritize white Protestant men and view everyone else as much lesser than, okay? You can tweak that all you want. You can put as much lipstick on you pig as you want, but the base engine, okay? The base, the source code, the bone structure of this test is still a tool to filter out minorities. Obviously, it needs to be completely overhauled and redone. But yeah, I was pretty sure standardized testing had like ties to like prejudice. The test has failed time and again to achieve their intended purposes, measuring intelligence and predicting future academic and professional success. The test, not the black test takers, have been underachieving. Absolutely 100%. Yeah, I agree with that. And that's just a microcosm of our entire system. We have a country that was built on the idea of prioritizing white Protestant / Christian men with land and money over everyone else. And until there's like really a complete overhaul, a lot of things are still going to serve those purposes and that purpose and ultimately those people.
To understanding its impact on people's qualifications leading up to that point.
What about the alternatives that are being discussed? And you even heard it mentioned there by one of the other young students about, instead of checking the box, incorporating it in your essay.
That is something that people currently do. But as we've seen from states where affirmative action is no longer allowed, like, for example, in the UC system, we have seen a decrease in diversity on campus, and they've tried many different...
It's super weird. You take away affirmative action and all of a sudden it's a lot more white people.
Ways to bring diversity to their campus, but so far we just haven't been able to see the same kind of diversity. So for now, affirmative action seems like it's still necessary.
It's 100% necessary.
We'll continue to follow this, of course, from the steps of the Supreme Court. We'll bring you back, Chelsea. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So yeah, great. Affirmative action's under attack. I'll keep up on this story, try and keep updates coming on it. I've been trying to do that with quite a few stories. It's hard to keep them all in my head. In fact, I should write that down. Yeah, we'll keep an eye out for updates on this. I really hope affirmative action holds, because like I was saying, it's so clearly needed, so transparently needed, that, I mean, we literally have, the proof is in the pudding, right? And like, there's already a few states that have done away with it, and they have less diversity than they did before, which is exactly what I started this thing out saying. So I feel like it doesn't get much more clear than that. Thanks for watching, guys. Follow me on Twitch to join us live, like and subscribe, and I will catch you later.